Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. My name is Kevin Castley. Tonight we're joined by another panel. We're going to be talking about North Korea, Kim Jong-Un, and Donald Trump's reaction. Over the last few months, or rather the last couple of weeks or so, it was clear that there was an absence of Kim Jong-Un from official ceremonies and whatnot. He missed the Day of the Sun commemorations in North Korea. As additionally, over the last few months, it's been pretty clear that his health has been in a very poor state. However, he's back, and there was a lot of speculation. We obviously had the panel on here that talked about well, could he be dead? There was a lot of speculation flying around that he had been undergoing a heart procedure. He may not have made it, for example, and it was around this time, of course, with a lot of speculation flying, a lot of buzz out there, that there were people in the West, really cringy people in the West, that were mourning, that were sad, that were praying for Kim Jong-Un to have a speedy recovery and come back so that he can continue to be the communist dictator of North Korea. Really, really embarrassing stuff for our civilization, of course, to see these types of fifth columns about on Twitter. However, he did make it through, and he's back. And we're going to take a look at a video right now. This was, I believe, released May 1st by Korea Central Television, and it is carried here by Global News. So we'll take a look at it, just a couple minute clip, and then we'll get into the discussion. So.
Oh, he's in the chat.
환영곡이 울리는 가운데 경의하는 최고領導者 김정은 동지께서 준공식장에 나오셨습니다. 전체 참가자들은 탁월한 용도로 구체적인 필요공업 발전에서 새로운 전전을 안아오시고 자립경제 강화를 위한 혁명적 대진군을 승리로 이끌어주시는 경의하는 최고領導者 김정은 동지께 최대의 영광을 드리며 폭풍같은 만세 환호를 바쳐오렸습니다. 대성 동지, 조선노동당 중앙위원회 제1부부장들인 김여정 동지, 조영원 동지, 당 중앙위원회 일꾼들 샤시고.
So there he is. He's back. He's back. There were a couple things that stood out in that video. And we'll go to the panel. But before we get into that, I do just want to say briefly, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Be sure to go and follow this channel over on Twitch at the link below. We're streaming right now to both Twitch and YouTube. However, if you watch on Twitch, if you follow on Twitch, that helps us more, honestly, than if you watch on YouTube. And that's because Twitch has easier thresholds for monetization, which will support the channel. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel faster, more directly, you can go over to patreon.com/superpower broadcasting and help out the channel there. So there you go. You guys saw this. We got Kim. He's back. And what happened there was, he's giving this big sort of, pomp and circumstance. He's declaring the opening of this fertilizer plant, and you've got thousands of people that are basically, paraded out there. They have to wave the pom-poms of the dear leaders, and they're all wearing the masks because, of course, the pandemic is in the air, but they're all standing like 5 centimeters apart from each other. And what's interesting is how Kim and his entourage, of course, they're not wearing any masks, which, I mean, I understand for propaganda purposes. You couldn't have this, quasi god type figure wearing a mask. It would make him look, vulnerable. I get that, but for the other officials and stuff over there, still, that's it reminded me of the whole Mike Pence thing. Like they think that just because they might be a regional party minister or whatnot, that they're above the virus or whatever. It's like, it's kind of dumb. I mean, I can only imagine how many cases there are in that country right now. You got 25 million people and one of the worst healthcare systems in the world, right? So, but where are you guys' thoughts, and how are you guys doing tonight?
Oh man, it's definitely not the cringiest video you've showed us here, but I mean, he still to me doesn't look that healthy. It looks like they just put some makeup and dolled him up a little bit,
Yeah,
but he still doesn't look that healthy.
Well, the other
So,
thing is, I think when it comes to Kim Jong-Un, right? Like, I feel like his time wasn't then, like when we all were speculating. I feel like if it's not, a couple weeks ago, it's going to be within the next, 10, 15 years. Because the thing is, you can't have that kind of unhealthy lifestyle and live until like 80 or 90 years old. So, like, if he keeps if he keeps this up for a long enough time, with like all these health conditions that he supposedly has, which I don't even know how many he even has though. I mean, it's only a matter of time. Like he could have more problems like just even 5 years down the line. So,
I agree. Yeah, the only
and I
thing
think the
that
other
yeah. Oh, the only
what
thing that
else?
I would say is as a counter argument is that his grandfather Kim Il Sung lived until 1994. I forget exactly how old he was. He must have been going on like his 80s at that point, and he was fat the whole time, basically, ever since he became the dictator in
But
48.
did he
So,
have this? But did he have the same kind of health problems and stuff like that as Kim?
well, he did have a lot of health problems. He also had like a very large neck tumor, which was benign, but it was very massive, and so every time he would be at a public ceremony for the last decade or so of his reign, they would have to take pictures of him at different angles and Photoshop it out or whatever, because you can't have this god type figure having medical problems and whatnot. But for him, he I don't really know too much about like the cardiovascular health that he had, but he was definitely overweight, substantially overweight for the like almost all of his rule essentially. And of course, Kim Jong-Un, on the other hand, Kim Jong-Un was very skinny as a kid. If you see the pictures of him in Switzerland and stuff, he was a pretty lanky kind of guy, like to play basketball and stuff. But then when he became the leader, he had to fatten up to emulate the image of his grandfather so that the people would associate him with the nostalgia of the time when they actually had food. Because as I've talked about before on this channel, Kim Il Sung was a brutal dictator. But it is a fact that for almost all of his rule, you were better off economically living in the north because they at least had food and one dictator than in the south where it was coup after coup, and they were basically a backwater. And of course, this was because the Soviets bankrolled North Korea very well. America didn't support the South Korean regimes to the same extent to really keep their economies afloat to the same level. But of course, when the Soviet system fell apart, North Korea fell apart. Whereas with the South, they became a democracy in the late 80s, and they had a 40 times economic growth in the last 25, 30 years.
So, there's your friend in the chat. Do you want to add him on soon?
That's you're talking about Henry here?
Your other friend. Oh,
no, you're talking about Henry. I see him with like the red and yellow profile picture and stuff.
Do you want to add him?
Well, I don't know. Henry comes on the show all the time. Sure, like Henry's always welcome on, but yeah, that's Henry right there, LARPing as Millsrow in the chat. We can bring him on later on in the show. I do have a tweet I want to go to first, just on the thing about if Kim Jong-Un is going to last as long. I don't think he's going to last as long as Kim Il Sung, but he does have access to the best medical care in the world. So, I mean, that's what $15 billion can get you. So,
right. I mean, I think the other thing with the Kim family is that it's like I feel like though, like having like a heart surgery at like 35. I mean, isn't he 35, right? 30, something like that.
Well, we don't know for sure because we don't know his official birth date or anything. Yeah, I believe most people consider him to be between 35 and 36, but we
But
really
that's
don't
still
know.
pretty. But he looks kind of like well, I'm gonna assume he's like in his 30s or maybe
Yeah.
early 40s. But I mean, so there is a range, of course, though. But
Mhm.
I think the thing is, though, that's like he looks kind of a young guy to have a heart surgery. Like that's pretty young. Like, so I don't know what's going on with him.
Yeah,
No.
well, I mean, he does eat very poorly, but yeah, we'll go to Jaeger here.
Now, are we sure he's not born in Kenya and Muslim?
I want to see those birth certificates, damn it.
Yeah.
Oh man. Oh man, that's an old meme. That's a throwback right there. I forgot about all that. But you know, the current president of the United States, he based a lot of his political trajectory on criticizing Barack Obama's birth certificates, of course. You know, him and Alex Jones. That was a big keystone of Trump's political identity, right up until the election, of course, was you know, I'll offer $1 million to anybody that can prove that Obama was born in Hawaii and stuff. And he released his birth certificate. Well, I want to see the long form birth certificate. And did he really go to a university and all those kinds of statements? Yeah, no, that guy became president of the United States. So he's the president right now. And that kind of segues us into the tweet that I have here, because with Kim Jong-Un coming back and appearing at the opening of this fertilizer plant, it's apparent now that he's still alive. We can speculate on the extent to which he's unhealthy and whatnot, but he's still alive. He's still alive, and we talked about on this program while he was absent from the big day of the sun in North Korea and whatnot. We talked about how, in my view, and Reese at Nightmare Fuel basically more or less agreed with where I was coming from on this, that if Kim Jong-Un died, given the political context of the era in which we're living in the West, it would actually be a bad thing, because it would mean that his sister would take over. And because she's young and a woman, she would have to kill way more people than he had to when he took power in order to get her point across and in order to consolidate authority. And so if he were to have died and Kim Yo-jong was the supreme leader right now, there would be, the beginnings of a huge round of purges that could see upwards of 100,000 people killed. Whereas when Kim Jong-un came to power, only about 10,000 people were purged and executed in order for him to consolidate power. And so I was making the point that, it's not something to really celebrate if Kim Jong-un dies, simply because we have this political culture right now, the era of cringe, as I call it, where we're not going to seize the opportunity. We're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to sit back and then let them have a new dictator and let them build up nukes and let them fine-tune their delivery mechanisms until they can threaten us credibly with being able to destroy our entire civilization many times over, so that they can take the South and get away with it. And we won't do anything to stop them. And I would say that Kim Jong-un dying would be a very good thing if we had a leader like George W. Bush, or if we had a leader, even a leader like, for example, a Harry Truman figure, perhaps, or Ronald Reagan in office. It would be a very bad thing if he were to die right now, because we got Moon Jae-in in the South who wants to be buddies with the communists in the North, and he's basically like Korean Tulsi. And then we have in America, we have Donald Trump, who we're going to get to the tweet here. He just sings the praise and mourns Kim and everything. There's no cohesive and united front to take advantage of that opportunity to liberate North Korea. If North Korea were to be liberated, it would be a very good thing that Kim Jong-un died. But given that we know that nothing would happen on our end, all that would happen is more misery for the North Korean people. So with that, we're going to go to a tweet here. So that's the nuance. Like, I hate Kim Jong-un, but in the context of the time in which we're living, fewer people are going to die because he survived this than if she were to take power right now. But Donald Trump tweeted this out, and of course there's no nuance or anything here, just praise, just singing the praise of the dear leader, somebody that he admires, somebody he wants to be like when he grows up. We got Donald Trump here saying, and I quote, and this is in response to a tweet by Lachlan Caradog, who says, Kim Jong-Un cut the tape at the ceremony marking the completion of the Suncheon phosphatic fertilizer factory in Suncheon in North Korea, and he's got the pictures and everything showing Kim, alive and everything, and then Donald Trump responds with, quote, "I for one am glad to see he is back and well," end quote. And it's such a bad tone. I've seen people on Twitter saying that, well, he has to do this because he's trying to, make them give up their nukes, so he has to feign this concern for their leader in order to be on good terms in negotiating. And I'm just thinking, like, one, he's not doing that. Even if he were to try, even if he were to genuinely try, he would fail. That's something that George W. Bush and Obama and Bill Clinton couldn't do. Donald Trump just incapable of it. He bankrupted a casino. He can't do it. Second, North Korea never negotiates in good faith. They'd never give up the nukes. They if you offered them $100 trillion right now in cold hard cash, they wouldn't do it because they know that would be the end of the regime, and so they'd rather have what they have now than risk losing everything. And they're smart in that sense. They know what would happen. But Donald Trump, I think he genuinely is friendly and gets along with and admires Kim Jong-Un. I think that I think personally that he was more upset about Kim Jong-Un being, in serious medical trouble than if one of his allies, like Justin Trudeau or Boris Johnson, were in medical trouble. I really get the sense from him that he wants to impress the communist dictators more. So that's my thoughts on that. What do you guys think?
I think this is one of the dumbest things he's ever tweeted. May even be the dumbest thing. I would take grab him by the pussy all day compared to this shit. Completely idiotic. He's a dictator.
So I think it's crazy because it's like he will treat Kim Jong-Un better than like people like Mitt Romney.
Oh,
like
yeah.
I'm just gonna keep it for real.
Yeah, he'll call Mitt Romney a communist, but then he'll go and praise an actual communist dictator. Like CPAC decertified Mitt Romney, quote, as a conservative. In other words, they said, oh, he's not a conservative, he can't come, even though he was the nomination for the Republican Party for the 2012 election. That's insane. They call him a lifelong Democrat and a communist. And you're like, okay, but this guy is a lifelong communist, and he's not even a Democrat. He's the head of the Korean Workers' Party.
Well, the other thing is that it's like him and like other people like that are big fans of him, like they'll rip on like George W. Bush for his video that he made, but they think that like Kim Jong-Un is cool. Like, how backwards is that?
Oh man. It's the sort of thing that like this guy, Donald Trump, he basically copied Reagan's slogan, "Make America Great Again." And yet, unlike Reagan, who made the communists in the Soviet Union basically bow down, and of course there's that famous video of Reagan saying to Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and Gorbachev tears it down. Like, that's badass. That's like some hawkish. I mean, he was so hawkish he didn't even have to use his military to win the Cold War. That was how ascended that Reagan was. And Donald Trump goes and takes his label because, of course, Reagan won, I think, like 49 states in 1984. And so he's like, oh, well, I'll just take his aesthetics and everything and his slogan and maybe I can replicate the performance. And it's like, yeah, but Reagan detested communists. He was a very staunch anti-communist. Donald Trump is only really anti-communist insofar as he's against communist-minded people in the United States. But when it comes to real lifelong communist dictators on the world stage, he only has the praise, man. Like, I mean, he sung praise here as well as Korean Central Television would do, except they have a gun to their head and he doesn't. So it's embarrassing, man. But we've got Anthony Avisto-Bisson here. Welcome to the program, Anthony. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Kevin. Hello, Jaeger. Hello, Anthony. I was just busy. I got an email yesterday that one of my articles, the state of U.S. engagement in post-ISIS Iraq, was actually released yesterday, and I only got the email today. So I guess it's just time difference. I was just sharing that on my media pages. But besides that, I hear that Mr. Kim has magically continued to keep living, which is a bit of an unfortunate development. I mean, then again, we did at least get the meme of his, his sister being like, everyone having simping over his sister, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of memes about that. I didn't get a chance to download any today. I've been pretty busy, but I did see a lot of memes about that. But we can save those memes, I guess, for in a few years when Kim has to do another heart surgery or whatever. So,
yeah, North Korea would go from one of the poorest countries in the world to the richest country because all the simps would start donating their money to his sister.
But you know what that would mean? That would mean that Nutso Liz would go bankrupt because her Patreon would dry up because they'd all start giving money to Kim Yo-jong.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing when it comes to the whole Kim dynasty, that it's like if a female takes over, I actually unironically think there will be people like Hassan Piker that will praise her. They'll be like, hey, they had the first female leader and we didn't. He'll actually use that against us.
But he opposed Hillary Clinton, right? Like
because she's a neocon according to Hassan Piker.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Being a neocon is worse than purging 100,000 people and being a communist and everything, which is what she would have to do. Like, she would have to purge way more people than Jong-Un had to do when he consolidated power. I mean, it'd be a bloodbath in the country. Like, again, there's nuance here on this channel. Obviously, Kim Jong-un, not a good guy. We don't want Kim Jong-un to be the leader of North Korea. But if he did die, a lot more innocent North Koreans would die when she consolidated power. Now, instead, they're going to be killed over a longer period of time due to like starvation, poor sanitary conditions, poor medical conditions, poor economic conditions. The list goes on and on. It sucks that we have leaders that just stand idly by and just let this regime go on and on and on unchallenged and unquestioned. So, it sucks.
Well, it would be a difficult war, too, to go into North Korea because they're kind of built a little bit defensively. But at the end of the day, we should probably do it now in the next 5 or 6 years to prevent us from having to do it later when they want to invade Seoul. And even if they jump from Seoul and they go to Tokyo, and then all of a sudden, we lose that part of the world.
Oh, for sure. I've made this point many times on this program, and you all can check out my video, North Korea's Endgame Parts 1 and 2, in which I go into this in depth over the course of an hour. There is no choice between peace or war with North Korea. That war is inevitable. The only question is, do we do it now? Or do we wait until they get enough nukes and fine-tune their delivery mechanisms to the point that they can blackmail us to stay out of the conflict and they can 1v1 South Korea and then take the peninsula over for themselves? So there is going to be a war on that peninsula at some point this century, I believe in the next 15, 20, 25 years. So once they have about 1,800 nukes and once they've gotten their accuracy down, on the ICBM. So, Anthony keeps jumping in and out, I guess, due to connection issues. But yeah, so that statement, though, I just found it really disgusting to see that from the leader of the free world. I mean, imagine if George W. Bush put this tweet out. I mean, even imagine if Obama put that tweet out. I mean, I've criticized Obama to no end on this channel for his doctrine of what I call strategic procrastination, what he called strategic patience. But even he wouldn't go out of his way to sing the praise of Kim Jong-un. He just didn't want to do anything about it. But in this case, Trump, not only does he not want to do anything about it, he wants to lend legitimacy to the regime. It's pretty sad. So Pretty sad. We do have a lively chat tonight. I'll see if there are any interesting comments in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, I just want to respond to this. One person named Alex Radsoff that's told me to unblock him. I just want to respond to you. I think if I is correct, I think it's Alex. What is it? Alex Nader Monitor. I think that's what it is.
Oh, that's the guy.
Yeah. I just want to sort of say that I'm not going to unblock you, sir. Not with your recent behavior and your recent comments. You're more than free to follow me on an alternative account if you so wish. But I, for one, just totally don't want to actually know you or engage with you. You've already sort of shot yourself in the foot with a number of your comments in the past. So that's all I've really got to say on the matter. So no, I will not unblock you.
Yeah, I'm just reading through the chat now. Actually, he's saying back here that he says Kevin actually blocked my last account, and I was pretty hurt as well. I was very bothered. You're good friends, it seemed. Well, no, I've said before. I said to you, Alex, that you threaten to dox people, and I have zero tolerance for doxing. So, I mean, in addition to the other things you said, now granted, I wasn't going to jump on that bandwagon to just immediately block you over stuff like that. I had genuinely thought that you were sorry about stuff, but then of course you told me that that you weren't apologetic about the homophobic remarks, and so
Here's
I don't see anything productive coming of this, so I'm going to be blocking you from the chat now. So
hey Kevin, you
Yeah.
have to unblock Mills Row. I gave him the link, but it's blocked. So I don't know if you blocked him from the stream or whatever. But if you want to have him on, he said he can come on now.
We'll see. I'm having an interesting conversation here with Anthony Avistu, Bisson, and Jaeger too. I feel like Millsrow would definitely derail things at the moment. For sure.
I just wanted to say I've as I said, I've heard your debates with Millsrow. I don't have really much opinion on the man, to be totally honest. I can't really give a fair assessment of him before I even, I guess, get to know what his comments and his statements are. But I've seen statements that you guys have shared with me. I understand your concern, Kevin. I don't necessarily mind, but I do understand if you think he's going to derail the conversation. I'm game for anything that you wish to do or others wish to do.
Well, I mean, we've kind of gotten to everything that I had prepared for tonight as far as the sources and stuff go, because I was pretty busy today. I wasn't planning on having this be like too long of a stream, probably more around the hour and a half mark. And so at this point, I don't really have too much else to say about like Kim Jong-Un, Donald Trump, and everything. Like I've said before, I'm not one of those orange man bad type people. I've given Trump credit on some of the actions he's done with respect to Iran, pulling out the nuclear deal, pulling out, or rather killing Qasem Soleimani. I think that these are things that he deserves some credit for, in my view. But on North Korea, he's failed 100%. There's nothing that I can give him credit for on North Korea, and it's disappointing. I want to give him credit. I like if he got tough and got serious about dealing with North Korea and everything, I would give him credit. I'm not one of those people who's just going to say, "Oh, well, it's Trump, so now I have to defend Kim to own Trump." Like I'm not. I know some in the mainstream media would actually be like that to some extent. I'm not like that. But that's all my thoughts there. If anybody else has any thoughts on these stories, feel free to give your remarks. You've got the floor, and then after that, I guess we can bring Millsrow on. I'll see about removing the block.
So one thing like Trump has done as far as a lot of things in foreign policy, he'll say one thing and then his administration does another. But in this case with Kim Jong, I think it's more going to go along those lines of what he's saying, where they're just going to leave him there, do nothing, keep him in power, and just, like you said, eventually they're going to try to take the South, and we may not be in a position to stop them. And, it's one of the things, and I don't even know if Biden would be as hard as we need to on North Korea, but he's going to be a step in the right direction as far as when it comes to North Korea.
I mean, you could be diplomatic with people without having to legitimize the regime.
Yeah, and there's that too. Like it's just it's the tone of it that really kind of got to me, because even if you were somebody who was going to pursue a diplomatic course, like Obama was trying to do for the most part, you wouldn't send out that you're glad that he's alive and well. It's just it comes across in poor taste. Like you wouldn't tweet that about Hitler, you wouldn't tweet that about Stalin. So why would you tweet it about Kim Jong-Un? It's just it's pretty gross in my view. So
I would say that, yeah, when it comes to Trump's comments on Kim Jong-un, it's really, it's kind of actually depressing to see that the United States president is saying that, because he's openly sympathizing with a mass murdering, individual. And regarding North Korea in general, I don't know the proper response, I guess, that we would take to North Korea, because as I've heard you mention before, Kevin, that it is sort of a frozen state. So whatever has to happen has to come really externally, because internally it's just too fragmented and too, I guess, I don't want to say the word weak, but I would have to use the word weak to describe any internal dissent. Because as you mentioned, mentioned in a couple other videos prior that, you have the military the armed force are divided from the Air Force and Navy and so on, and the whole system is really designed to keep one small dynasty alive and crush all forms of dissent. And that is very hard to, especially when you're trying to talk about changing the style of the regime, because if you have no internal dissent, then it really is a sort of a process of, okay, let's intervene, and we'll have to essentially rebuild the state from scratch, which is something that is most likely will probably be politically unpopular. And that's why it's a very contentious issue that I don't see any one way of dealing with it, to put it straight.
yeah, no, and that's part of the problem right there, is that North Korea is the hardest country in the world that you could foment regime change in by simply providing assistance or aid to anti-government forces. There are no anti-government forces. If anybody thinks anything against the regime, they can't speak to anybody else about it. And if any rumors emerge, whole villages will be killed. So that's the problem. There's chatter here that Milsrow can't come on because he's blocked. Yet I'm looking through the list of blocked users, and his name isn't on there. His account isn't on there. So I'm not sure what's going on with that, because there's nothing here that would indicate that he's blocked. Okay. You know what? That's incorrect. I was checking on the YouTube side of things. On the StreamYard side of things, that's right. I did have him as a banned guest. I'll remove that right now. There it is. He can come on now. So my bad.
Or you can come out on, buddy.
There we go.
It's about to get fun.
Yeah.
This is where we get the
There we go.
views. This is where we get the entertainment. This is what we live for, buddy. We live for the debates. Because I'm here for the blood sports. I'm here for the debates, the smackdowns.
Oh man, is he really going to come on and like defend Kim, or like what did he say?
No, I don't think he's going to defend Kim. One of the things in the conversation I had
identity theft is not a joke, Kevin. Okay, it astounds me that you'd allow Henry for.
Yeah, you can continue your thoughts, Jaeger. I just muted him because he had no concern or regard for your speaking order. So
it's all right. It's about to get intense, but yeah, just one of the things we discussed about in the last one is with the Korean War. We had a disagreement. So in the mind of him, if the North would have taken the South, Korea would be in a much better place today, like Vietnam.
Oh, gross.
And my point was it was kind of a stalemate, because really they went back and forth and nothing really changed in the war other than setting up a demilitarized zone. But I think he can defend himself on that one.
Yeah, well, with that, Jaeger of course had his time to speak. Millsrow immediately came in and started speaking right away, but we muted him. But now it's his turn to speak. Hello, Millsrow.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that when we look at the similar nations elsewhere in the same region, that it appears that Vietnam, aggregate Vietnam, is better off because of what happened to it, because it went Ho Chi Minh, than were it we to continue and to split up the country as we did with Korea. I think that if we're going to think about it in that context, that the effect, therefore, is that were Kim Jong-Un to take control, but to have access to the economy, the international economy, not simply to the Chinese economy, that he almost certainly would have had larger and stronger voices within his government that pushed in a different direction. And the result of that would have been that he would be much more like Vietnam.
So your perspective here is that everything would have been great if we just let the communists win immediately, and then they would have reformed like Vietnam, as opposed to my perspective, which is we should have done more to help South Vietnam so that South Vietnam would have been Vietnam, and then there would have been no need to reform because they were already a capitalist ally, and same with the South.
So
they started the war. What do you mean we divided them? What do you mean we divided North Korea?
Yeah, absolutely.
North Korea invaded the South.
Sure. So let's be very clear. If I had the choice to have either the South Korean government or the North Korean government, obviously I choose the South Korean government. Similarly, if I had a choice between the North or South of Vietnam, I would obviously choose the South in that context as well. But the point is that that's not the actual options that we had. The actual options that we had were spend millions of lives, spend billions of dollars, and potentially lose. In both cases, we did lose. It was a kind of a stalemate in the context of Korea, but we certainly lost in the context of Vietnam, regardless of how much money we spent. And so had we not spent that money in the context of Vietnam, I think that we would have gotten the same result. And if we had not spent that money in the context of Korea, the result would have been that it would have been much more like Vietnam. I don't think that like when I think about the reasons that that Korea went the way that it did, it's because of the allies that they had. South Korea became basically the same as America because South Korea's only ally was America and her allies. South Korea didn't have access, certainly at the beginning. Now it's a little bit different, but at the very beginning of South Korea's control over that territory, they didn't have access to the Chinese economy. And so obviously they weren't going to be affected by the Chinese government or by her policies. And similarly, North Korea was not affected by NATO policies, was not affected by the policies of the EU. Once it came to power, it was not affected by the United States.
Oh man.
Well, do you disagree?
So you're saying that we should have just basically forfeited all of Eurasia over to the communist bloc, over to the Red Menace. That's your argument. We should just had it in the towel, said, oh, why is anything worth fighting for? Democracy doesn't mean anything anywhere. Let's just condemn the free people of Asia to the same fate as the enslaved people of Asia.
Do you think that we condemned Vietnam?
Oh, absolutely. Wait, you do know that I think that we should have pursued that to the end, right? Like,
sure, but do you think
I would have used even nuclear weapons
Vietnam?
to win that.
Do you think that we condemn Vietnam? Do you think that we condemn Singapore? Do you think we condemned India? Right. The point is that like there's an ability to not go to war.
Singapore and India are not.
Yeah, they weren't communists. But the point is that neither of those countries did we invade. Did we forcibly create into puppet states of the United States as we attempted in both Vietnam and Korea? But the point is that both of those states, I think, are very good examples of non-allied states that ended up being extraordinarily powerful economies because they were able to trade both with the United States and with China. I think that Vietnam has moved into a much more of a Singaporean, much more of an Indian model with respect to its relationship with China and America than North Korea or South Korea has been able to do because of continued tensions between North and South of Korea that are the result of the Cold War.
You do understand that part of the reason why that happened was because American capitalism became hegemonic in the world, and after America won the Cold War, people in Vietnam recognize that we should aim to reform to have a share in the prosperity of the American-led order. Now, if America had just said Vietnam, Korea, let's just follow that through the logical conclusion, West Germany, France, UK, all these countries the communists want, let's just have them take them over and not do anything about it, then I don't think America would have won the Cold War. I think the Soviets would have won the Cold War then. And then Vietnam would look a lot today like it did under Ho Chi Minh, for example. So you're missing the fact that the reason why the U.S. won the Cold War has a huge, or the fact that the U.S. won the Cold War has a huge bearing on the direction that Vietnam eventually wound up taking. So.
So I want to be very clear. When we're talking about Germany, it's a very different story because Germany was the result of World War II that had already happened. World War II had to happen for a variety of reasons. And so I very much support that war. And I also think that the result of that was that we already did control Germany. And so Germany had to be divvied up at some level between the powers that had already taken control over it. It made sense that we were going to continue to hold control of it once we already had control. We didn't have control at any point over full Korea. We didn't have control at any point over full Vietnam. And so for us to try to take over them is a little bit different. The larger point, though, is that I think that when we're talking about capitalism, we have to be thinking about, like, what exactly do we mean by capitalism? Because China has very much a state capitalist model. And I think that, frankly, they really always were moving towards that as a direction. I think that was an inevitable direction for them to go, because it's the direction that Russia itself went, even prior to sort of the heights of the Cold War. State capitalism is still going to have market forces affecting them. And so when we're talking about the state capitalism that I'm referring to in the context of Vietnam or in the context of Korea, it still is going to have the effect of drastically pushing towards a more urbanized and towards a more industrialized economy.
North Korea does not have anything like a Chinese.
No, absolutely, you're totally right. And the reason, though, is that they're closed off to the world from an economic perspective. Their economy is in shambles and has been for decades because they don't have access to the world economy. They only have access to the Chinese economy and to their slave labor abroad. Right, but it's not a serious economy at an international level, whereas South Korea is, whereas Vietnam is increasingly so.
State capitalism is basically a communist talking point to try to distance yourselves from the reality of communism in China and Vietnam and the horrors that it's wrought upon the populations. I understand that there's a difference between what Deng Xiaoping enacted and what the Soviet system looked like. I get that. However, to describe it as a capitalist system or state capitalism is a lot more of what somebody might imagine Pinochet being like a fascist type system that allows for free markets. Communist China is not, they're not a very capitalist system. You basically have to have the approval of the government to do anything. You cannot open up business from a foreign country in there without basically having a subsidiary that's entirely run by the Communist Party. You can't even own property there. You can't own household.
Property is a very. We should not get into land. Land is going to be a very complicated conversation.
For 99 years.
Land is a very complicated.
Describe them as state capitalist sounds like an anarcho-communist.
One at a time, please.
Yeah, that's fair.
An anarcho-communist piece of propaganda to try to distance your idea of communism from the reality of communism in China. So I don't think that it's fair to describe the model of modern China as being actual communism. I think it's very much. I mean, when we think about like all of these different Huawei, whatever company you might come, Tencent, whatever companies are coming to your mind, those are examples of companies that are very much interlinked with the government, very much sort of following the marching orders at some level of the government, but they're also at some level still, no, I'm not a communist, Henry, not even remotely. I am definitely a libertarian. But
the point is that for us to be framing our policy, we should be focusing on ourselves. I actually don't like ultimately the job of the United States government is to protect Americans, and so when I'm thinking about our foreign intervention, it shouldn't be about like, can I protect the Chinese people from communism or something like that? It should be about, can I protect Americans and ensure that we have the best economic output possible, right? And so I don't really care if they're state capitalist or if they're state or if they're non-state capitalists. The result is that I'm able to trade with them regardless, and I'm able to better our own country through that.
You would trade with them after everything that's happened. See, I'm for a complete and total blockade on them until socialism in China.
You're saying China?
No. Now, what you said about them,
I just want to clarify.
what you said about them, yeah, I let you speak. You gotta actually be able to let people talk, dude. That you have to work on that. That's something that is going to get you nowhere in life if you continue to be like this. So learn to grow up. So on the matter of communism and the nature of communism in China, it's a fair point to say that, well, they're not technically communist because communism is the end state. It would be a more what's a proper description of it is that they have a political party, the Communist Party, which is striving to create communism in China. But as to what they actually are currently, I call them Communist China because they're led by the Communist Party. As to what their actual economy is right now, it's a socialist economy aspiring to become communist. So
what do you mean by that? Because they used to be more communist than they are today. So when I think about their economy, they seem to be. I agree that they're relatively socialistic, approximately today. Certainly more authoritarian than the kind of socialism that is thought about in the United States. But
the United States is not a socialist country.
No. I'm saying when people in the United States are talking about the word socialism, that's not the kind of socialism that's being discussed by like a Bernie Sanders type figure. That's much more a sort of Swedish kind of. But regardless,
Sweden is a free market system.
Yes, and the free market system kind of socialism is the kind of approach that Bernie Sanders is ultimately supporting. As
no, it's not. Sweden tried what Bernie Sanders wanted back in the 60s and 70s.
Universal health care. They have.
When he talks about
universal health care, when he's talking about getting access to housing for everyone, those are kinds of examples of things that we already have in many Nordic countries, and all three of them. And when we're talking about it, that's something that's true across much of Europe. I think it's fair to say that's the kind of socialism that he's striving for. So I just want to clarify that there's
there are representatives from Denmark as well as Norway that have come out and said that they're
okay. I don't want to focus. I don't want to harp on too much on Bernie Sanders. The point is,
no, dude, you brought it up, and I think it's important to the discussion here. Is Wyatt Claypool says in the chat, Sweden and Denmark, as well as to my knowledge, Norway, get insulted in terms of their leaders, their officials, when Sanders thinks that he advocates for their type of system. Because, of course, if you pay attention to it, they tend to have very low regulations. They tend to have higher taxes, but lower regulations in many areas. They are, in many ways, more capitalist than the United States, and in some ways, or I should say more of a free market system than the United States. And they don't have the type of healthcare system. In fact, no country in the world has the type of healthcare system that Sanders is advocating for.
If you're arguing against regulations, I'm libertarian. Like, I agree with you. But the point is that, like, when Sanders is describing his model, he's describing something that is based on the foundations of the model that is true in Northern Europe. Right? He's not basing it on the Chinese model. And the larger point, coming back to China itself.
Wait, I didn't say he is. I didn't say he was basing it on China.
Right. That was simply my point. And I apologize because it clearly was a tangent. I don't mean to be moving away from China, but the point was that when we talk about China as being a socialist country, I agree with you, but I want to put in the context for the audience that is not the same kind of socialism that's being described by American socialists like Sanders. Coming back to China itself, you were saying that it's socialist and it's trying to strive towards being communist, but the reality is they were much more communistic 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago than they are today. If we're talking about them becoming more and more urbanized and more invested in the international economy, they appear, certainly that Huawei, certainly that Tencent, are examples of companies that are becoming much, much more capitalistic than they were 30 years ago. Is that not true?
That's not true. They're entirely dictated by the Communist Party. They're basically extensions of the Communist Party. As to whether or not they were more communist under Mao, their economy was a lot more similar in many ways to a quasi-feudal sort of order under Mao, at the regional level at least, than it is today. Marx himself even said that you have to go through a capitalist market stage after agrarianism in order to get to socialism, to get to communism. Mao's China had never been a market industrial country, so they were nowhere near communism. They had, if you believe Marx, if you read Marx, if you see what Marx would say about it, he would say that, and this is what the Communist Party in China says: in order to get to communism, you have to go away from the agrarian. Now, Maoism, of course, was different.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify about Marx, I mean, like, Marx was clearly wrong. Like, when we talk about like the actual USSR, the example of the USSR is a really powerful one. That's the one that sort of succeeded to the largest degree in terms of instituting a communist model, and they didn't get that from the people who had already gone through industrialization. Those are the people who are on the cusp of industrialization and seeing Europe decided to go a different direction, right? So I'm not sure that I would agree with, like, I agree, you're right that Marx said it, but I think that it's fair to say that Marx is wrong, and that the capitalist model is further away from communism than is feudalism. Right?
That's no, but Marx himself even said that capitalism is a progressive. He said that capitalism is a progressive force insofar as it leads the economy away from a feudal order towards an order in which workers have power and control over their own destinies, and that leads to socialism, and then you eventually get to communism. And so the leaders of the Soviet Union and China both recognize this. China post-Mao, of course, because in the Soviet Union, Stalin, of course, pursued, copying basically Trotsky's model, a policy of forced collectivization of agriculture. And why did he do that? It was so that they could urbanize and industrialize as soon as possible. They didn't care about the peasantry. They collectivized so that they could get as much grain as possible to factory workers as soon as possible, to build up the industrial base as soon as possible. They basically tried to speed through 300 years of the Industrial Revolution, like so 20 years. To be clear,
I think that theory is a very important thing, but I think that when we have a choice between looking at theory and looking at actual history, I think we should choose history. When we look at the history of the USSR, the reality is that the people who were pushing strongest to get towards a communist revolution were peasants, were people in rural areas. It was not the people who were going through industrialization. It was not the people in the cities. And so, given that, I think that we should be approaching.
That's incorrect.
No, it's not incorrect.
That's incorrect. If you study Soviet history, you'll know that Lenin had to basically do an agitprop campaign to brainwash the peasantry. It was only the urban industrial workers that supported the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were the minority in that case. The agrarian peasantry.
In terms of the aggregate numbers, the aggregate number of people who pushed for it, you're right that the leadership was an educated leadership, and so the educated leadership across the board in every country is of course going to be people who are on average going to be more urbanized than people who are not. Of course, that's true. But in terms of the followers were people from rural areas. The aggregate number, the total number of people who were involved in communist sort of rabble rousing that built up towards the USSR, certainly those people were more rural than they were urban. And the point is that they were also less industrialized and therefore less capitalistic, more feudalistic prior to it.
Yeah, but if you read the people that championed the revolution and sided with the Bolsheviks, ultimately, even the ones who came from the peasant communities, from the agrarian regions, they were leftist-minded people that
of course
saw themselves. They basically fled the countryside for the cities to become factory workers. So yes, they had a rural background, but they aligned themselves with the aspirations of Stalin and Lenin.
Right, but my point is simply that when, like, the propaganda of communism is a propaganda where, you're right, they consider capitalism to be closer to communism than is feudalism. But the reality, boots on the ground, when we look at the history, is that feudalism appears to be the only track, the direct trajectory between feudalism and into the communism of Russia, imperfect as it may have been, of course. But that is the actual trajectory that we have a history of. When we think about it in the context of Vietnam, that's a history that we actually have context of. When we think about it in North Korea, that's a history of an example of. When we think about it in the context of Cuba, these are all examples that we actually have. We've never really seen a truly capitalistic country that was truly industrialized, really kind of a first world or emerging first world power that then transitioned into a communist sort of system. I don't actually believe that that's the case, that that's going to happen or that it has happened. And therefore, when we're talking about China 60 years ago, which was much closer to feudalism, and we talk about China today, I think it's fair to say that China was closer to communism then than it is today.
Okay, so the one thing that we definitely agree on there then is I would say that I agree with you that first world type capitalist industrial system, the type of system like Germany or something that Marx envisioned as being closer to following communism would never happen. I agree with that. There's just too much in terms of prosperity as well as labor unions and things that would never see a revolution take hold that Marx really couldn't have predicted in that sense, because of course the capitalism of his time was a lot more brutal and didn't result in the same degree of prosperity that we see today. And so we agree on that point. But when it comes down to communism altogether, you're kind of missing or brushing over the fact that most of those countries that you listed pursued a very aggressive industrialization policy because they were largely informed by Marx saying, well, you can't just go from agrarianism to communism. You have to industrialize first to provide a mode of production to act as the intermediary between a false consciousness, conservative agrarian population to a socialist, class conscious working class. And so on the point about communism in China, though, the exception is that Maoism was a peasant-centered brand of Leninism. So it was a definitive stray away from Marx in that sense. He saw the peasantry as the focus as opposed to the workers. So
yeah, so I think that's there's a degree to which propaganda works in tandem. And so when we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, they see all sort of movement forward as being a movement towards communism. One example of movement forward, really regardless of your political ideology, is just getting more money into the hands of either the people or the government, which is just to say the economy writ large, regardless of where exactly that is in the economy. In order to build up your economy, by definition in this world, you have to build up your industrialization. You have to be moving towards a more Western, if you will, economy, just in terms of like the infrastructure that you have access to. That doesn't mean that it's actually required for communism, right? Like communism is a model for how you distribute the money. Industrialization is a model by which you get more money. You see what I'm saying?
Well, the difference is it's not just industrialization per se. It's a specific type of, urban, specifically to clarify, a very sort of urban-centric, model, which is based on a planned economic structure, the 5-year plan type things that Stalin had and that Trotsky wanted, but Stalin basically copied his ideas. That whole sort of thing is very different than what they did in China, where Mao pursued the Great Leap Forward, where it was a very decentralized sort of thing in that it was local communities smelting steel in their backyards. It was a total disaster, of course. And so you can have industrialization that isn't urban. It just turned out to be a total failure. Whereas in North Korea and the Soviet Union, where the leaders pursued rapid industrialization, it was very centrally planned. It was very heavily urbanized. And it was successful in the sense that they did bring up their production of things like steel, tanks, that kind of stuff. In fact, even in a wartime economy like the Soviet Union had, there's definitely an argument to be made there that's one strength of that socialist type system, that they were better at producing tanks, for example, on a command system than a free market might be. And the United States even, of course, had to go to have, presidential directed production during World War II. So
yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right that the reality is, when we're talking about the fight between communism and capitalism, that sort of controlled or dominated the world stage for 50 some odd years. That the reality is, you're right. The United States had to, in order to win that war, quote unquote war of ideas, required that we had some degree of state capitalism. It required that we had things like a NASA program that was paid for by the state. It required that we had things like state paid for military stuff. It wasn't all just contractors. I think that this is very true. That like the actual model that works is somewhere in between a primarily state-run thing and a primarily open market run thing. That being said, that's why I think that Vietnam or a yes, Kim-controlled but a unified Korea would have been much better, because those are examples of countries, once there's a single country that has access to, can trade with both the United States and with China, they're no longer beholden to a single one of those entities exclusively. And because of that, they're going to end up somewhere in between the not actual reality of what China was, or not actual reality of America was, but rather the the propaganda that is being built up by them. When we think about like North Korea today, North Korea is not the same as China. It's substantially worse. It's substantially more communistic than is China. And the reason for that being that they have to sort of super serve the propaganda of China, right? They have to like even more so than China itself. It's kind of a crazy thing where in order to succeed, they have to be more so what China wants them to be than China does itself. The same thing would be said, I would argue, for like something like Guatemala, which is just crazy. I mean, like I'm building up a thesis paper on Guatemala and their land tenure, and it's just fucking crazy because they have built up their capitalist structure to such a degree that they just don't have real land tenure for like 80% of their population. But anyway, I don't want to get into Guatemala. The point is that we need to be building somewhere in between these two. And the way that you do that is by having a unified Korea.
Yeah, I want a unified Korea under the South. What I don't understand here is that you seem to be brushing past. Now we can take this from two angles. The first is looking at things from our context now, and the second is looking at things from when the U.S. intervened in 1950. If we look at things in 1950, the United States had a firm policy of containment that said, we will contain communism anywhere and everywhere it encroaches upon the free world. And so the United States, in order to, and it wasn't just the United States, it was actually, this is something that gets lost on a lot of people. A lot of people will always cite the UN or they'll cite international law to condemn Bush and whatnot. But the United Nations approved the Security Council of the UN approved the police force that went in and pushed back the North Koreans. In fact, from a multilateral standpoint, that was perhaps the most legitimate campaign that the U.S. did. That and the Kuwait repelling Iraq out of Kuwait in the 90s. Those two both had an extreme degree of international legitimacy, and yet you're still siding with Kim.
Yeah, so I would never in my wildest dreams try to defend the United Nations as a legitimate body that like actually has power. It's a cute little way for diplomacy to be done between more than two nations, but it's not an actual like real thing with real powers. In order to have power, in order to have law, you have to have a military to back it. And obviously the United Nations does not have, I mean, it has a military, but doesn't really have a military because everyone's just on contract from their individual government. So quite obviously, when we're talking about, wait, there's some weird background noise. Does someone have their?
It comes from you, mate.
I think it's coming from you. Like it sounds like there's a window open or something.
I don't think so.
Try muting your
no-
mic temporarily and see if that cancels it out. Otherwise, it's somebody else. Yeah, it was you.
Huh. Oh, it's still stuck there.
You might want to change your mic setting to be unidirectional so that it's only taking your voice as an input instead of the surrounding noise, if you're able to do so.
I'm not. Oh, but it went away.
I just want
I don't know
to.
yeah, I'm sorry. I
quickly-
totally. Yeah, go for
I
it.
just want to quickly interject. I don't want to be rude, but can either one of you just quickly get to your point? Because you guys have been yammering on about this topic, and I see it going off on different tangents. And I don't want to be the one guy, but I'm just thinking to myself, okay, you got to this point, but okay, what was the central disagreement? I guess so. That's
Yeah,
all.
absolutely. So my premise would be that I think that the best way to sort of wage, if you will, intellectual war and succeed on the sort of international stage is to Henry. I'm ignoring you. I love you though. Is to try to approach it through economic power. I think that soft power is much better than hard power, generally speaking, because economic power allows you to really wage war in a positive manner, and that sort of builds up the economies of other places, and that is something that lasts for a long period of time, and it's also beneficial to the people. War, when it's military, costs the United States a great deal of money, whereas war, when it's economic, you'll notice that like China is actually directly advantaged because of their interactions with Africa, which are also, of course, increasing their power on the world stage.
Yeah, but Milsro, what you're missing is that the North Koreans started the war. Do you take the North Korean side that the South invaded them, or do you believe the truth?
I don't care.
No, but it matters.
It
how
doesn't.
How does it not matter? There's a difference between defending yourself. Like in your case, you seem to be stepping even outside of even like a Ron Paul sort of line, because Ron Paul would say, well, if you're attacked, if your allies are attacked, you have to defend them, but don't do regime change wars offensively. That's his argument. You're saying your allies attack, don't defend them. That's even more extreme than like Ron Paul, man.
Yeah, so I think that when we're talking about Korea, at that time, it's not really fair to say that we had an ally. I think that the reality is that is a country that we had never been seriously involved in prior. The same thing is true of Vietnam. Obviously, Germany is different. Obviously, it's different when we're talking about something like Cuba. Obviously, it's different when we're talking. There are examples by which it's a very different circumstance. But in the context of those two specific wars, I think it's pretty clear that there was no one who was on our team prior to it, and that we sort of built up a team, and that the same is true of the Russians/Chinese.
But you don't understand that once you have a pro-American side in the South, and you're fighting a Cold War with Moscow, that when they invade to try to take out your foothold in Korea, you can't just let them have it because, it would take energy to repel them. I mean, what I don't understand is like you kind of are bouncing back and forth between an almost realist sort of argument and then a more of an internationalist sort of argument, because you talked about how the UN is kind of, you brush past and say, well, you don't really see them as having too much force. And I would agree. Like, I mean, what you said there, just that clip of that kind of almost sounded like John Bolton. But
yeah, I would describe myself as an economic realist. I think that the only powers, there are two kinds of power that exist on the international stage, and that's economic power and that's military power. I think military power sometimes works, but it only works in the short term, because the reality is, unless you're willing to do it forever, which is basically the model of the John Bolton type people, that's not something that you're able to continue into the future. The reason that our relationship with like Germany works now, the reason that it works with Japan, is not because like we're fundamentally friends with Germany or Japan. Obviously, we're not. Look at World War II, but it's because their economy and ours are intertangled and are interrelated in such a manner that we are both benefiting from that relationship, and so it would be stupid for either of our countries to attack the other. And that's the way that you're actually building up safety.
But your characterization of hard power as necessitating a permanent engagement somewhere, it makes no sense at all. John Bolton wants a quick and speedy removal of the regime in Korea, followed by a reunification with the South, where the South basically foots the bill to rebuild the country and creates a prosperous land across the peninsula. But it would take at most a 5-year serious commitment from the United States. The military engagement itself would last probably less than 3 years before the North was neutralized. So I don't understand this forever wars thing that's out there, even in the most extreme cases of nation building, like in Iraq, where you don't have like the South Koreans to do the nation building. If everything were followed through properly, it could have been done in under 30 years. I don't understand the whole forever war thing. So Milsrow either left or his internet connection cut out. If his internet connection was the case, he can come back in and we'll continue the discussion. Otherwise, we do have a lot of comments here. I just wanted to speak to the hard power thing very quickly. To me, it's interesting to see somebody who disregards the UN and disregards that type of multilateral approach go on to argue that soft power is more important than hard power. I haven't really seen that before. Usually it's the other way. But
so Kevin, just real quick to clarify your position before I think he comes back. So your position against him is obviously that economic liberalization does not equal political liberalization, because you're interested in politically liberalizing the people, because you see as trade not benefiting the people to a free democracy, correct?
Well, if we were talking about China, yes, but we're talking about Korea. My point is that the North invaded. He brushes past that and says it doesn't matter. My point is that if somebody invades your foothold somewhere, you're waging a Cold War. You can't just let it slide. If you let that slide, then your enemies know that anywhere else in the world they can attack and you won't do anything. In other words, it makes it so that your deterrent, your military force, your resolve is now viewed as incredible by your opponents. I think that, and I've said this before, if you let the enemy take over and basically cock you in one flashpoint. So, for example, if North Korea goes in, takes the South, and America says, you can have it, we don't want to lose our cities to protect Seoul. Now, all of a sudden, NATO doesn't mean anything anymore. Now, all of a sudden, Russia can go into Estonia, Poland, Ukraine, whatever, because they know that American resolve means nothing anymore. And so my point is that if you're the hegemon, or if you're aspiring to be the hegemon, and somebody attacks your foothold or your ally or your puppet state, whatever you want to call it, you have to defend them. Otherwise, you have to fight war after war after war after war, because now your enemies don't take you seriously anymore. You see what I'm saying? So.
Yeah. I definitely see what you're saying, because I think that's the position you hold. I think the position that he holds is through trade and through economic liberalization that you can get the political liberalization, in which he believes that through that you get that national security benefit, right? I guess that's the position that he holds.
But we were talking about Korea. This is the problem. We're talking about Korea. Kim Il-sung invaded the South. You don't just then go and trade with Kim Il-sung and surrender the South and forfeit the South. Like that is beyond absurd. The idea, it's kind of like a murder or something. If you got a murder on the streets and they kill like one person, but it's going to cost a lot of money to find them. It's going to be really expensive to try them. It's going to take a long time to go through the court process. You're basically prosecuting them to try to get the death penalty. It was very heinous. It cost $100 million, say, in legal fees or whatever, to bring this one guy to justice. You could say, why would you spend $100 million? It was only one crime. But then you make the point now, you can see where this is going, that if all of a sudden the government said, well, we don't really feel like spending that much money to fight one murder. Now, all of a sudden, there'll be tens of thousands of murders, because now everybody knows that they can get away with anything, because the government isn't willing to pay a disproportionate expense in the short run to avoid having to run up incredible expense in the long run. And so if you just show that your alliance means nothing, now all of a sudden you're not just going to have one war on your hands that you back down from. Now you're going to have like 8 or 9 wars in the world as the communists try to take over Eurasia. And you can then either choose to fight them or not fight them. And pretty soon you're no longer a superpower. Now you're staring them down on the Canadian and Mexican borders as they come for you to consolidate communism worldwide. And so my point here is I'm a staunch anti-communist. I would have fought them anywhere. And Truman did the right thing there. And it wasn't just Truman, it was the United Nations. That's another thing. The United Nations is not like this holy sort of body that could just go in and do anything. But even the UN, that was the one time when they had the Security Council police force get the authorization to go in. That's how bad it was. I mean, and sure, you could say, well, the Soviets were boycotting it or whatever. I don't care about the Soviets' opinion, but the point here is that trade isn't an appropriate response to getting invaded. Like he doesn't care that the North invaded the South. That's kind of a big deal that they invaded, because now we're not having a conversation about should we do a regime change war against the North and proactively go in and end communism there. Now we're having a conversation about, does our alliance mean anything? Like that's a different conversation. Even some libertarians are like, oh yeah, well, if they attack your allies, you have to fight back. But Milsrow apparently doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that you should ever fight back. That's kind of ridiculous. So
I just want to say that it was UNSC Resolution 82, I think, if I'm remembering my history correctly, that was passed by the UN that approved of action, or actually condemned, I should say, North Korea's invasion, and that the UN actually backed the South Korean government as the most legitimate government out of the two. The United States, as well as other nations, by the way, because it's not just the United States that fought in the Korea War, it was other nations as well that we kind of forget a lot of the time. Although the United States did contribute the most amount of troops, we forget that it was the US, along with these nations, that essentially was pushing out the North. But eventually, of course, that ended at the parallel. But I do think that I didn't really get where the conversation was going. I heard him mention a couple of points, but they weren't really relevant for the reason why he came on to the stream. From what I understand, it seemed it was going a bit around the bush, if you will. Like there's no, it's like he wanted a conversation, and he mentioned a couple of things, and you had some agreements as well, but there was no, for whatever reason, there was no like. This is why I said to him, and I said to you, I said just like get to the point already, because it seemed like you guys were, at least most of him was sort of yammering on. And I know that's all good and dandy, but if you just keep yammering on without any point, like I'm kind of doing right now, it can be a bit stale. That's sort of like
I would say,
yeah. Well, I let him kind of do that, because like this is his like last sort of chance before I put the policy into place that it's like $100 for a debate going forward, because I'm going to take the channel in a more direction where I do more solo videos. I have like people that I like on. I don't really like talking with people like this myself, but you know, I put the offer out to Liz. I put the offer out to all these people that have been wanting to debate, like, hey, here's your chance now. And he finally came on. But to Henry, he's saying that, oh, he's actually backstage. Kevin won't let him on the stream. No, he's not here. He dipped out. He doesn't want to come on, I guess. So, you know.
I think the other thing, I think when it comes to Korea, is that it's like if for say the Korean Peninsula were to be taken over by the Soviet backed North Korean government, is that it's like we wouldn't be able to have trade with the Korean Peninsula, because there's no way that China and Russia would allow us to have any influence in the Korean Peninsula. It's like it's the same thing. It's like for the Marshall Plan in Eastern Europe, we tried to give it to Czechoslovakia and Poland and East Germany, but Stalin denied it. I don't think Stalin would allow us to have any economic influence in the Korean Peninsula. So then we would have to wait until after the Cold War to trade with North Korea, and then even then, I don't know if they would be an ally to us. And I think on the point of Vietnam, Vietnam is not even politically liberal. Like it's like it barely scores above the UAE. I mean, they jail journalists all the time. I mean, they're less of a threat to the United States, like directly though. But as far as like political I guess like freedom and liberty and the civil like rights and stuff like that. There's not much that's gone on in Vietnam. I mean, like you can kind of start up your own business that's like directed by the government, so like they've expanded some freedoms there, but like it's very minimal in the past 30 years. Even though that they are in free trade agreements with other countries.
Can I just say in response, just sort of to add a caveat? I also remember that he kind of was a bit ignoring ideological elements, because when it comes to especially China, it uses corporations as a vehicle for its ideology. It's a sort of an extension of the CCP's vision using these companies. And I think that that ideological element was touched upon briefly, but it was not touched upon as extensively as it could be, because we kind of forget. Also, there's this human element as well. I noticed as well, you ignored the human element. So if you wanted a Korea united that's somehow independent from China, somehow independent of the United States, but has its own system, regardless of whether or not it's authoritarian or not. I know that's very real politique, but that ignores the suffering of people underneath that newly created united, I guess, state. Because if you say it's under Kim Jong-un's, if it's a united Korea under Kim Jong-un, that's going to be an oppressive regime. And you may say, okay, but it's not influenced by China, and it's not influenced by the United States, so ergo it must somehow be its own good thing, really, because it's not influenced by either side. But again, I would just say that, and this is why I guess I disagree with a lot of the real politique kind of people, is that they do ignore the ideological and the sort of the humanitarian side of these things. It's very easy to say, okay, this is one sphere of influence and that's one sphere of influence, and fuck everyone else. But that does come back to bite you at the end of the day. It always does.
I think the other thing when it comes to Vietnam and South Korea, if you're going to pair up both conflicts, is that when it comes to Vietnam, with that reunification, it's still an extremely authoritarian government, whereas South Korea is very free, very free. So like, yeah, I see the Korean War as a success because we have guaranteed at least a state of freedom somewhere in the world, whereas in Vietnam, it's not free at all. I mean, it's slightly better than maybe in the 80s, sure, but like I would still rather live in South Korea over Vietnam any day of the week.
Yeah. And on that point, I was making the point to Milsrow, but I'm not sure how much the point registered with him. The point that I was making was that the only reason why Vietnam looks somewhat better today than it did back right after the Vietnam War ended is simply because the U.S. won the Cold War, became hegemonic. So they were like, okay, well, we have to somewhat play with the United States now. And some prosperity came from that, at least economically speaking, right? And American capitalism does have a high favorability rating with Vietnamese people, even though the government tries to basically ignore that fact. But the thing that's interesting, though, is that if the U.S. took that policy that he was proposing of, oh, the communists have invaded somewhere in Eurasia, let's not do anything about it, wait for them to take over, and then trade with them after, America wouldn't have won the Cold War. The Soviets would have won the Cold War. And imagine what Vietnam would look like today if the Soviets had won. It never would have changed. The only reason why they look somewhat better now is because America won. The reason why America won was because America was willing to fight that war in every corner of the world. Right. And the only reason why America lost in Vietnam was because Soviet-sponsored anti-war nutters basically cut the U.S. from within. They're a bunch of fifth columns. So
I think the other thing too, what a lot of people forget when it comes to different communist states is that like a lot of them are different. Like Vietnam is not as ideological as North Korea. I mean, North Korea has like the Juche system. It's like Vietnam is a little bit more decentralized in a sense, of course, because it's a little bit more communal compared to North Korea, I believe. Like because Ho Chi Minh had like some kind of like at least some kind of like grassroots kind of support, where it's like Kim Il-sung, I believe, was installed by Stalin in the Communist Party.
He was installed by the Communist Party, but there's some nuance there, because the cult of personality that emerged around Kim Il-sung basically made it so that within a few years he really did have that kind of legitimacy, because once the war was over, especially, you got to keep in mind, like, obviously I'm a defender of the South, But let's keep it real. Up until 1985 or so, you were better off living in the North, economically speaking, because the South was one dictator after another, and they had coups and everything, whereas the North had one dictator, and they had the Soviets bankrolling them. Now, of course, the South became a democracy, and that's because America won the Cold War, and because the South had the forces within it, the market forces within it, that enabled the middle class to emerge, that eventually demanded more political freedoms and brought about a political revolution that led to a further economic revolution that's known now as the Miracle on the Han River. Whereas with North Korea, rather, if they had been allowed to go on and whatnot, Millsrow's kind of acting like, well, they would have now been an independent state and all this. And I'm like, no, they still would have been a Soviet puppet against communist China. They just would have been a bigger puppet state than they were when they were half of the peninsula, right?
And
They
there's
still
no
would have
way
been.
that and there's no way that the Korean Peninsula economically was going to get influenced by the U.S. Like they were never.
Oh, no
they were
way
never
in
gonna
hell.
allow that.
He's talking about it as if Korea was going to become like a Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia had a split with Stalin. North Korea was always a puppet of Moscow right up till 1991. So
And
they
then
even
even
fell
with
off. So
And then even if you use the Yugoslavia example, I mean, Yugoslavia fell apart, after Tito. I mean, that country was extremely unstable. And even the amount of like economic influence, quote unquote, that we had there wasn't very much. I mean, sure, you can get like magazines or whatever, but it's like you can still get killed. I mean, you could still be thrown in the gulag. It's like,
for
okay,
sure.
like it's so like the extent of US influence in those countries wasn't even that much under that system.
I just want to also say that with a lot of the non-aligned countries and the non-aligned movements during the Cold War, people forget that a lot of these countries also became the fighting grounds for, you could say, these proxy wars between the Soviet Union and the United States. So there's no guarantee, even if you don't even align with either side, that you can be free from this you could say, war of influence. Because that's the thing, is that your country is likely, if anything, to become, like as in the case of Vietnam and other such countries, even in Angola and Botswana, or I guess you could say Botswana as well, before it became Botswana. The thing is that, if you're in these non-aligned areas and the war breaks out between either side, you're going to be constantly pulled by each side. And quite frankly, if it's between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's an easy choice. You could just have to compare between West and East Germany. It's straightforward as that. Do you want a system where at least, maybe it's not the best perfect system, of course, but at least you'll have some freedom of press, you'll have the cultural influence of the United States, Western nation? What do you want the Soviet Union, where essentially you're going to have just a different version of authoritarianism sprinkled in with a lot of propaganda, basically? I'm not going to say that the West is without propaganda, but let's just be honest. When you're like the Soviet Union, this whole social, I think it's a socialist realism that you're being pumped with in the Soviet Union. You're in a completely sphere where your freedoms basically are limited. And even we know that people in the Soviet Union, when movies would come out and that, they would watch these movies in underground areas and in places that is not, monitored by the Soviet government, because at the end of the day, they preferred Western culture, or at least the culture that was exported by the United States, to that of one exported by the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think, right. And I think the other thing on top of that was like, when it comes to economic liberalization, like, does it really bring about free people, right? Because I know me and Progressive Apostate were researching this together. And in the case of a country like Egypt, they've politically liberalized, economically liberalized. And they have free trade agreements with a lot of countries. And they have a lot of Western countries that come in. But Egypt isn't a free country. It's the same thing with China, right? China allows open markets, but open markets doesn't mean you don't get the boot. Like, you can still get the boot. It's just like, okay, so what if you own the property? You can't vote. So what if I can own, like, a small business, or own some kind of like conglomerate that like I can work for? You can still get the boot. It's just the boot's a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, you don't even own your own business or property in communist China. You're leasing your property for 99 years from the party, and your business is basically a function of the party. It's the same with the army. It's not the people's army it's the Communist Party's army, right? They're not there to defend China per se. They're there constitutionally to defend the party. So
Yeah, like because like I said before, I mean, I think it's just kind of a false kind of thing, because it's like, if you have more free trade with the country, doesn't necessarily mean it's more free. I mean, we have a free trade agreement with Mexico. Mexico isn't more free because of that, because I think the economics and the politics are very divorced in the global economy. I would say, like, very divorced, you know. So that's the thing, right? Because it's like, if you open up like a Ford factory in China, you give people jobs and opportunities, but ultimately they don't have political freedom. Like, those people that work at that factory, they can't vote or anything like that. They can't form like a union or anything like that. It's like they're just stuck. It's the only difference is, it's like, okay, instead of a state-owned Chinese company, they can work for an American-owned company, but they're still oppressed, just a little bit differently.
That's not even true. They have to work for an American-started Chinese subsidiary operating in the country. So you can't even just do Walmart in China. It has to be a Chinese subsidiary that's where the Communist Party has a big stake in it. So,
well, it's like some like lease, like some like off brand that they get. But I think you get the point though. Like, they have something like similar to that though, or what they do is they buy the license to the brand, like Ford, for example. Like, they'll just buy the license to it, and then they'll allow them to, like, make the parts or whatever in that country. So like, it's like, like that.
Or they'll just straight up rip off the brand name and build it themselves, like they do with Land Rovers, like everything. If there's a brand out there, there's a knockoff made in China using the brand's name that didn't have the authorization to do it. They don't recognize copyright law at all. So when people call them like state capitalist or whatever, it's like, that's not capitalism. That's like Lord of the Flies. They just jack whatever brand they want and build it there, because they know that the Communist Party, what are you going to do? Are you going to sue them? Like, they're not going to pay up. So they copy Disney. They copy, I mean, there's this famous meme, old school meme, of like this kid with a backpack walking around in a middle school, and his backpack was like, it was Obama, it was Harry Potter, and it was Sonic the Hedgehog, and it was made in China. And Chris Chappell over on China Uncensored highlighted it as one of the top 10 knockoffs that you could buy over there. And it was like, it made no sense. They just took like 3 brands that are popular with the kids in America, put them on a backpack and sold it. And you're like, yeah, but they had no permission to do so. It's not like they had a Sonic, like that. What is that? Like, who makes that game? Is it Sega or whatever? It's they didn't have the approval. They don't play by the World Trade Organization protocol. They're not a capitalist system. Anytime anybody ever calls them a capitalist system or state capitalism, it gets under my skin, because 90% of the time when they're calling it state capitalist, that's a communist who's trying to distance their brand of radical communism, usually anarchism or libertarian communism, from what they see as totalitarian communism, basically. So by calling it state capitalist.
And I don't know if you've ever saw, but like, they've also copied U.S. military equipment, like the Black Hawk and the Humvee.
Yes,
I don't know if you've seen that before. Yes. They copied it, and sometimes what happens is, like, they break down during parades. It's like, yeah, I know that wasn't a U.S. built Humvee. Like, I know you copied that. Like, what they do is they try to reverse engineer it, and they try to like engineer it themselves, and they'll call it like the QW something, and then it just like breaks down. It's like, okay, buddy, you're gonna fight the U.S. Like, your shit's gonna break down halfway there.
It's not even that. It's not even that. It's so funny. I mean, obviously, of course, they would want to copy American military hardware. That makes sense. America has good hardware, even though it's really expensive. So if you can copy it, you don't have to pay the licensing fees. You get good hardware. That makes sense. But they ripped off cheap Soviet planes. Like, everybody talks about and jokes about how much the MiGs suck and how they're cheaply made. Yeah, but there's a Chinese knockoff of a MiG they built too. They've got the Shenyang and the Chengdu and like all these airplanes flying around, and you're like, okay, but that's an exact copy of a MiG-21, except it's a crappy copy of a MiG-21, where they didn't even pay the licensing fees. They stopped paying the licensing fees in 1956, I believe, and they've been making them ever since. without Russian, like, so even the Russians don't get paid their compensation, their royalties. So
Right.
it's like they even rip off the communists. Like they rip off everybody, man. Nobody's intellectual property is respected. I mean, it's a joke. I mean, at least they paid licensing fees to the Soviets until '56, but it's like you get the point. They have no respect for the international economic order. So they're not capitalist. They're a socialist state that's aspiring to communism. So
Can I just? Okay, no, you finish your point, Anthony. I'll talk
I
after
was
you.
just gonna say real quick. Kevin, the Type 59, like the AK model.
yeah,
That's it. What's funny that it's like when you see like fighters across the world, they actually prefer the Soviet and Russian built AK-47. They don't prefer the Type 59, the Chinese copy, because that actually breaks down. Like bullets can get jammed. There's problems with it, like firing. It breaks, and like the thing is, it's really cheap, and people say like, "Oh yeah, like this gun's really cheap," but it doesn't work very well. They never work.
They never work.
Yeah.
It's like the masks that they sent to Italy. They sold. They didn't donate. They sold masks and medical equipment to Italy. 80% of it was unusable because it was of such a poor quality or expired. And that was their big charity display that they got all written up about and all praises in the mainstream media and stuff. And you're like, Western media. And you're like, yeah, but this is just a political stunt. Like their stuff sucks. And it's like, that's so funny because it's like, if I have to choose between a Western made piece of military hardware and a Soviet communist piece of military hardware, of course I'm going with the Western one. But then if you ask me to pick between a Soviet communist piece of military hardware and a Chinese poorly reverse engineered rip-off communist piece of hardware from a Soviet communist piece of hardware, I'm going to go with the Soviet one every time. Like, it's funny how much, like, they're a country of derivatives, essentially. Everything is derived from somebody else.
Can I just so now I want to just say that I think I was getting sort of the tad bit of impression, maybe I've been misheard this or misunderstood this, but I was getting kind of the subtext of some of what Milcher was saying was that somehow you can change these other states or at least pressure them or contain them, what have you, through economic means. But I just want to sort of say that you even in the 80s are a good example. We tried economic liberalization leading towards political liberalization with China, and we now know that project failed, that you actually can't change the political dynamics of a country just through their, the economic system. Because, we had this, it goes back to this notion that we thought that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization, especially when it comes to China. And that didn't work, of course. It changed. If anything, it made these countries more politically repressive than we had thought that they would become. And this is just another point, is that when it comes to these regimes, you're going to have to use a multi-pronged approach when it comes to addressing like China or these authoritarian regimes. There's a multi-pronged approach that, yes, includes an economic amount of pressure, but also a degree of hard power in terms of the military force or military pressure. And I just want to also say that there's not just economics and the military approaches. You can also go through the diplomatic approach, because I think Milcher said that there was only the economy and military that you can use to sort of do any significant change. But there's, of course, diplomacy. That's another route, as well as a number of other things as well. That or cultural influence as well. In other words, there's more than just those two approaches to, I guess, pressuring or to altering the dynamics of a regime. So I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and that's a good point to raise, is that part of that power that you can exercise, of course, is diplomatic. I mean, that was one of the key areas that the Cold War was eventually won, was by using your hard military power to bolster your diplomatic credibility. And if you have you can do diplomacy, and you can do diplomacy with regimes and stuff in certain cases and have it be successful, if you, of course, are going in from a position of strength, and you basically are going there and and have a preset sort of guideline as to what, what's going to be a minimum sort of standard in order to even have the negotiations and stuff. I don't think that they're really appropriate with North Korea, because even if you did take it seriously, North Korea isn't going to negotiate in good faith. But Gorbachev did negotiate in good faith. So,
I just was making that point to, I sort of in response to Mills. It's not really a point on North Korea per se, but it's just more a general point on international relations. It's not just the economy or military that you can use to, I guess, influence different states. There's many different ways, and I think that's sort of like oversimplifying it to the economy. Military is, but it's simply wrong. Essentially, there's more than one of those two. Yeah,
I think
diplomacy is something that definitely still matters at the end of the day. It was a weird approach that Milstra was taking, where he was arguing that military power really doesn't do anything, and that economic power matters. But what I guess what he was just missing there, in my view, was that the economic power that America has today is largely a function of American exercise of military power, as well as American capacity and the American credibility to utilize it. I think if America just said, we're not going to protect any allies anymore, or demonstrated it in that case, and just said, Kim can have Korea now, I don't think that the U.S. would ever be in a position to have the kind of diplomatic and economic influence that America has today. I think this has got to be a combination of all the three, and you got to take them all seriously. So,
and I think the other thing that's kind of interesting when it comes to China, that it's like they can't even be original about it. Like, at least the Soviets were like a little bit more original. It's like the Chinese communists. It's like they're trying to like be like everybody else in a way. Like they're trying to like take like other things, and it's like they're totally like. They're like they think they're like hot shots, but they're not. I mean, I don't know if you saw. I think it was a couple weeks ago. I think it was a month ago when that Chinese heli carrier, I believe, that burned on fire. I think sent me that article. The whole thing burned on fire. I'm like, holy shit! Like if they can't build that right, why should we get other things from there? That's what I'm asking. Like,
I mean,
medical dangerous.
Well, it's not the only thing that they can't build. I mean, they took the Soviet model, going back to kind of the rifles, everybody started talking, but the Mosin-Nagant from the Soviets, which is known for its reliability. You can bury it in the backyard, unbury it in 3 years, and it'll still fire the same as new, but it's a piece of shit. That's why you can find them at gun shops for $75. Well, they started to mass develop this rifle, and then they started exporting it to other countries like in Kosovo and that. And their model was so much worse than the Soviet model that they eventually started using them as clubs because they couldn't get them to repeat in the fire. Like, of all the things in the world, like that, the Mosin-Nagant's one of the easiest rifles to make and manufacture, and they somehow messed that up.
And they screwed it up.
If you look at the Venezuelan military, they have a lot of those VABs, I believe, those armored cars from China, because China supplies most of Venezuela's military. And you could see some of those cars, like if you look in those videos, like they stop a lot. They have they have engine problems. They have a lot of different problems. It's like, dude, that's a joke. Like, if you're trying to show off your military power, that's a joke, dude. It's like, you want to like take on America, dude? All right, dude. Like, you won't even get halfway there.
They don't even have the excuse anymore. At least back in the 60s and 70s, they were one of the poorest countries in the world. Whereas now, they always talk about how they're like the number 2 economy or the number 1 economy by purchasing power parity. And you're like, you're still making crap of the same quality for your military as if we were like in 1964. Like,
I just want to also say, just interject. Sorry, I think that, and I don't know, maybe this probably isn't true, but could it be the case that China is supplying these other countries, sort of like the countries that it's in when it comes to the One Belt, One Road initiative, or its allies, with these sort of like less than subpar equipment, just in order so that they know that their allies are weaker than the Chinese military is? You know what I mean? Like, you're giving your allies in terms of like a thing to sort of like make sure that, in case they ever try to go to get war against you, you will always be able to beat them. I know it's maybe just the case is that China just basically does that crap shit, but I'm sure that they're doing it also for political reasons and also to make sure that those states are not really well armed, that, at any point, if they need be, they could always take out these states without a problem. Maybe that's just my speculation.
Well, my view of that, though, is that what we would need to see in order to know that was the case is we need to compare the quality that they export to the stuff that the People's Liberation Army themselves are using.
That's true.
Because my reading of it is that they're knockoffs of like the MiGs, they're knockoffs of Soviet rifles and all that they export are the same grade, the same production quality as what the Red Guards and stuff within their own country uses. But maybe their modern stuff, at least their Air Force now, is better than the stuff that they're selling abroad. I know America will often only sell certain variants to other countries, and in some cases won't even sell particular pieces to anybody else because they don't want it to be reverse engineered. But with communist China, they do sell a lot of stuff abroad. But my view of it, though, was that it was the same quality as what they use domestically. But I just simply don't know on that. Do any of you guys know the answer there?
I don't. But it's surprising the amount of arms that they're dealing throughout the world as well. But it would make sense. It would make a lot of sense for them to give just a tiny bit worse products to some of the people they're doing business with, because a lot of their business deals are shady, and they have to go in and seize property assets as well. So it would make a lot of sense.
Well, the other thing is China is, I believe, the third largest exporter to Africa as far as like arms trades go. And we would have to see it, I guess, pan out more, because there isn't like a lot of like research and like a lot of stuff we've seen like from Chinese military stuff. Like we've seen like some stuff like Venezuela and like Cambodia, like a little bit of like military, I guess, like action or combat. So we've seen like a little bit though, but like we would need to see a lot more, because it's like when you look at a lot of these civil wars, it's mostly like Russian military equipment or like American. So you would have to measure it going into battle. And I would say the other point to that is what's kind of scary is that like China is taking over as like the largest arms dealer in Africa as opposed to Russia, because like even Russia can't even get the same deals. And the thing is with the Chinese, that Chinese like will sell it at an even lower price, and it's like these people are in for a rude awakening if it doesn't work. So I think it's interesting, because it's like, even China like competes with Russia on the world stage because they want to make sure that they get ahead of them, because they see Russia as also like an adversary too. They're not the same,
Well, they've always been adversaries since like the 50s, right? So
yeah, they haven't been too friendly to each. I mean, they've kind of been more of allies than anything else, like allies by having a common enemy. But yeah, they would go after each other as well. They're not too friendly. Even during the communist era, they weren't exactly great friends.
yeah, they fought a skirmish in the 60s that saw 10,000 troops involved, artillery shells fired between the Chinese and the Soviets on the border near Mongolia. And this was and soon after that, Nixon basically, he had a relationship with Mao such that if a nuclear war did break out, China and America would have fired nukes at Russia, and Russia would have fired nukes at China and America. So,
Well, I think another thing that explains, I guess, maybe to like Russian military hardware is that the Iranians want Russian military hardware. They don't want Chinese, because they've done multiple times of like, hey, we want to get this aircraft or whatever, because the Iranian Air Force, well, especially specifically the IRGC Air Force, has always wanted like MiG-31s and Su-27s or whatever from Russia. And like if they ever get an offer from China, they normally like don't really want it. Like at least as far as like big conventional weapons go.
For sure. Yeah, but the Chinese ones are cheaper though, is the thing. Like they are cheaper to purchase, but yeah.
Right, but the thing is, like the IRGC doesn't even want like the Chinese built aircraft, so that kind of tells you something. And I think and the only reason why they haven't been able to get the equipment from Russia is because of the arms embargo, the conventional arms embargo that was passed, I believe, like a decade ago or so. So So it's pretty telling because even our enemies like Iran is like, yeah, we don't really want the Chinese military equipment. So I find that pretty interesting. You know,
Well, I
so
do just want to say now, we have a Dean in the chat. Thanks for being with us here tonight. He's asking if he can come on, and normally, oh yeah, for sure, but I'm pretty tired, and we're already coming up on the 2 hour mark, and so I'm trying to avoid like the 4 hour streams as a regular thing and stuff, and so I do kind of want to wrap this up right now. But you can come on tomorrow night though, Dean, if you're able to. I'll be here at 9 p.m. Pacific time, 12 a.m. Eastern. So with that, we're going to go around to everybody's closing remarks, and yeah, it's kind of unfortunate he dipped out. I didn't really get the sense that things got too heated between Millsrow and myself this time, but I guess for whatever reason he left. But we'll go to Jaeger DePato for your closing remarks, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the thing we were just talking about China is they emphasize quantity over quality. So you can't really trust anything that comes from there, whether it's military or whether it's other things for the length of the product should last. And then with North Korea, as we started this and Trump's words toward the dear leader, it like I said, it's probably the dumbest thing he's ever said, and he said a lot of dumb things. And there's no way a leader of America should ever say something that incredibly stupid, especially with North Korea, country that has nuclear weapons and is looking to take over the South. So this next election, like I said, I don't know if Biden's going to be a lot better, but he can't be worse than Trump.
Yeah,
on that front. So, but that's all I have.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. That's the thing. Like I've said many times before, I don't even really think that Biden's too much of a hawk anymore. But he's a professional guy who stands up for American values and doesn't admire despots and everything. And sure, you could say it's a low bar or whatever, but I think that Biden, at the end of the day, would be better than Obama even. I mean, because Biden has a record going back, several decades of being much more forceful when it comes to foreign policy against terrorists and despotic regimes and stuff. Whereas Obama, of course, is a lot younger and everything. And he really kind of approached things from a more diplomatic perspective. I think with Biden, it would be a bit of both. I don't think that he would just invade Iran or North Korea or anything, but he definitely wouldn't be respecting Kim Il Sung. And of course, I wish that that it was Biden versus somebody like Mitt Romney or somebody like versus like Nikki Haley, somebody where no matter who wins, you're going to get an improvement over right now. But of course, Trump getting a second term might just make all this stuff even worse. So, yeah. But thanks for coming on. We'll go to Anthony Avista Bisson. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Jaeger and Anthony as well for being on. It's always nice to come on these streams when I can. I've recently started up my YouTube channel again at Anthony Avista Bisson, so this is going to be a little bit of a shameless plug a little bit. But I am in the moment sort of producing a Yazidi video that I should be out by sometime during this week. But I just wanted to say that I am streaming again, and I'm going to be trying to produce some videos as well, because I think that it's very important that young people especially get into these topic matters, because Kevin's doing his service, I believe, to the internet by actually allowing these conversations to facilitate. Yeah, sure, at the moment they're not going to get as much traction as they could be, but everyone has to start somewhere. That's the reality. Everyone has to start somewhere. And I know myself, when I started writing, no one really bothered to read my stuff, and it's not as big as as it could be, but as I said before, you got to start somewhere, and it's always good to have these things going. So I do thank Kevin again. I have to pop off now, but as I said, thank you for the discussion. It was interesting between you and Millsrow, although I wish Millsrow had gotten to the point a bit faster, and there was a bit more, I guess, coherent coherent arguments rather than going off on tangents. I mean, I'm guilty of that at times, but I've learned how to curve my communication as of late. But thank you again, Kevin. Thank you, everyone else.
Oh, yeah, no, thanks for coming on. Anytime, Anthony. Always great to have you on the program. Have a good day. On that point, just before we go to Anthony Roberto, I do kind of want to say there, just to the point that Anthony Avista-Bisson was making about the reach of the channel here and whatnot. I'll often get this remark on Twitter, especially on Facebook too, of haters who will say, oh, you only have 216 subscribers, or you only have 300 subscribers, or you only have 82 subscribers, or whatever it happened to be at the time that they're commenting. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not a billionaire. I'm not a celebrity by birth. Like, everybody starts somewhere. Everybody starts from zero, unless you've got a ton of money to just buy subs or whatever. Why would I want to do that? I want an organic base. The other point though is it goes in the other direction though, which is that every time we go live, there's always like, 20, 25, 30 people here. And I appreciate that, because for a channel this small, a lot of channels this size could go live and have like 2 people or 1 person watching. So 30 people ain't bad for a channel of 300 subscribers. So thanks for being with us, watching the program. And, we get about an average of about 165, 170 views per video on a channel with 300 subscribers. Not too bad. That's better than Young Turks. That's over 100 times better than Young Turks. So, there is that. And we're just starting out here. And eventually there will be a point of inflection. There'll be a turning point. There'll be a point at which they go from saying, you only have like 8,722 subscribers, nobody takes you seriously, bro, to whatever the point is, to wait, he has 19,000 subscribers. Those must be paid. That must be CIA. I mean, I already had Stone Toss accuse me of being astroturfed already. And like, I'm not that big right now. So at some point, they'll change the narrative from nobody listens to you to all those people who listen to you, they must be fake and paid by the deep state. Because at the end of the day, they'll never be able to tolerate a young neocon coming on the internet and making, serious points. Because in their view, they live in echo chambers, whether it's the far right or the far left, and they cannot imagine somebody who's not a boomer, basically, believing in America, believing in Israel, believing in the liberal order, believing in the West, believing in capitalism, believing in freedom. Those are all boomer things to them, and I don't care, and I'm not going anywhere. And I'll be doing this until, I'm like 70, 80 years old or whatever, as long as it takes until we liberate the world. And that starts with changing the political culture. And with that, we're going to go to Anthony Roberto for your closing remarks. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as far as, I guess, like, like what's happened today, I think it's interesting. It's been a little bit more of a slower news day. Besides the North Korean stuff, I looked at other stuff, just kind of the same. Hopefully I can get back into the regular daily basis of like everything that's going on. The problem is that it's like, as of right now, with the COVID stuff, there isn't like a lot of reporting on different regions. So it's a little bit harder to get information. So, it's going to be slow for a while because everyone's focused on COVID, of course, and with everything going on. But yeah, I mean, I thought the conversation was interesting, but I mean, I don't think the central point was, because I think like what Anthony said, there was a lot of beating around the bush, I guess. So I don't know, like maybe if there was another time with someone else, hopefully the point could be more direct. I did like how it was more civil though. There was no name calling or anything like that. At least it was more productive. I mean, I think it was more productive this time compared to last time. I think last time was kind of a shit show.
Yeah.
So I liked how you guys were both able to hash it out. And then I was on that front is when it comes to, geopolitical situations, it's a lot more nuanced than I think most people believe. And on that note, thanks for having me on this platform, and I greatly appreciate you having me on here to talk.
Oh yeah, no, anytime. And that's the thing. I appreciate you guys coming on and everything. And that's another point about this. Like as the channel grows, we get more subscribers, we'll get more reach and everything. And obviously a lot more people are going to want to come on and everything. But you guys are the OG Hawks. You guys are always going to be welcome on, right? No matter how big this channel gets. And it's always awesome to talk with you guys. And And with that, we're just going to go to my closing remarks phase. Kind of what Anthony Roberto was talking about there. There was kind of a slow news day today. Obviously, there is some news with respect to the pandemic. Mississippi has gone back on their reopening procedure because they realized, well, you know, we've had a spike in cases. This isn't going to work. And I think Georgia's probably going to have to do the same thing. Florida's going to have to do the same thing. Texas is going to have to do the same thing. It's unfortunate, but this is going to be plaguing us for a long time, and it sucks. And at some point, you just kind of have to bite the bullet and just say, you know, we're just going to follow the course of the lockdown for a month or a month and a half, 2 months, and just weed out the trajectory, flatten the curve, and hopefully things can return to normal then, as opposed to taking this half-assed approach or this 1/10th approach that Georgia took under Brian Kemp, for example. But, you know, tonight's stream was more about North Korea. And of course, we had Mills Row on to do the debate. And yeah, it was more civil than last time, but in many ways, it was less direct than last time. And so there's a bit of a trade-off there, I guess. But when it comes to all of that, I think it's really unfortunate that we have the so-called leader of the free world at the moment, President Trump, basically celebrating a communist dictator, and it sucks. And I think it's inarguable that Joe Biden would be a definite improvement over that. You know, I've said many times before, I don't think that Joe Biden is hawkish enough for my taste, but he's definitely a lot more than Donald Trump. And so, you know, I of course like Joe Biden. I like Joe Biden as a person too. I don't really like Donald Trump as a person either. And I think going into the general election, Joe Biden is a much more likable figure, way more likable than Hillary Clinton, and a lot more likable than Donald Trump. And so it won't be a battle like there was before, where you had an unpopular person running against an unpopular person, and then one of the unpopular people just eked out a victory by like 70,000 votes across 3 states. It won't be like that. It'll be like a 2-point win for Biden. It'll be like 2%, you know, and like hundreds of thousands of votes across a few states in favor of Biden. If we get a general election in November, I mean, if you know, it could always be the case that Trump postpones it, but who knows? With that, just to kind of close out here, I'll say be sure to like this video. Every like that you leave the channel helps us out in terms of the algorithms, in terms of expanding our reach here. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. We're up to 306 subscribers now. That's awesome. You know, we're growing every day. Let's keep that momentum going. Also, be sure to go and follow the channel over on Twitch. We're aiming for 50 followers. We're up to 18 followers right now. Got to get to 50 to get affiliate status. So be sure to go and do that. And then, of course, if you'd like to just, directly contribute to the channel financially, you can go to patreon.com/superpowerbroadcasting. And even $1 helps out, because we're in an uphill battle here. We're taking the internet back from the era of cringe, from the internet establishment when it comes to media. Kremlin Kyle Kulinski, Neckbeard Jimmy Dore. We got, Alex Lost My Kid Stone the Libs Jones. We got Cheesy Charlie Kirk. We got obviously Nazbol Nick Fuentes. We got all these guys with this huge following, and they all hate America, and they all hate the idea of American values being a global thing. And in that respect, we're trying to basically hawk pill the world, and of course we disagree, and we have our agreements and disagreements and everything, but this is one of the few places where you'll get a conversation that isn't just a left or a left right, a left winger, a right winger sitting down, and they might disagree on economics or social issues, but they'll always agree on foreign policy and say that America's the bad guy. We're pro-American here. So with that, I'd like to just say, thanks for watching, everybody. I'll be back here tomorrow at 9 p.m. Pacific, 12 a.m. Eastern with another panel. And thank you for watching. Have a good night.